The moment the negotiations ended, I stood up and extended my hand. Victoria Hale looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "No." 15 CEOs were watching on the conference screens behind her. And just like that, the room went silent. My name is Elena Vargas. I'm 47 years old. And for the past 20 years, I've been the person companies call when international deals are too complicated for anyone else to close. 9 time zones, 15 CEOs, $2.4 billion in partnership agreements, and 30 seconds earlier, I just finished the final negotiation. I kept my hand extended anyway. "Victoria," I said, calmly, "the negotiations are complete. We're ready for the MOUs." She didn't take my hand. Instead, she smiled. Not the polite kind, the kind executives use when they're about to make an example out of someone. "You're no longer needed," she said. A few of the CEOs on the screens leaned forward. One of them muted his microphone. Another stopped writing. Victoria turned toward the head of the table and picked up a folder that hadn't been there 5 minutes earlier. "I'll take it from here," she continued. "Security will escort you out." I glanced past her. The conference monitors still showed every participant. Tokyo, Munich, Singapore, Oslo, London. Not one of them had disconnected. "Victoria," I said quietly, "but the signing session." "You've already done enough," she cut in. "We're moving forward with new leadership." Behind her, someone shifted in their chair. A lawyer cleared his throat. I lowered my hand slowly. "Understood," I said. Then I picked up my briefcase, no arguments, no protest, just a quiet walk toward the door. Because there was one thing Victoria Hale clearly hadn't noticed. The conference line was still live, and every CEO who had just watched her fire the lead negotiator was still listening. So why hadn't a single one of them said anything yet? And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. The elevator reached the lobby before security did. That didn't surprise me. Inside the conference room upstairs, the call with 15 CEOs was still active. The monitors would still be glowing with faces from Tokyo, Munich, Singapore, Oslo, London, and half a dozen other cities. And every one of those executives knew exactly who had just walked out of the room. International partnerships aren't built with corporate slogans. They're built with people. 20 years ago, Meridian barely had a presence outside the United States. Most of our overseas revenue came from small regional agreements that rarely crossed legal jurisdictions. Then the company started chasing bigger deals, multi-country ventures, infrastructure partnerships, technology licensing agreements that stretched across 3 legal systems at once. That's when they started sending me Shanghai, Zurich, Singapore. Negotiations where the difference between license and transfer could shift $200 million overnight. Deals that lasted 18 hours without a break. And slowly, the same thing happened in every boardroom. The executives stopped calling the company, they started calling the negotiator. For the last 6 months, every conversation about the $2.4 billion partnership had gone through the same channel. Not the CEO, not the board, me. When the draft MOUs were circulated to all 15 companies, the header on every document included a line most executives barely noticed. Lead negotiator, Elena Vargas. It wasn't marketing, it was structure. And everyone involved understood why. The person who builds a deal is usually the only one who knows how to keep it from collapsing. Upstairs, Victoria Hale had been CEO for 8 months. In that time, she had attended exactly 1 negotiation session. And even then, she left halfway through. The board didn't care much about negotiations. What they wanted was leadership optics, a younger executive, a stronger public image, someone who could stand in front of investors and look like the future of the company. My phone vibrated again. Another message from legal. They were already reviewing the final signing checklist. Inside my briefcase, the small titanium case sat in the side pocket. Most executives assumed it was just another security device. They never asked about it. Inside that case was the encrypted signing token, the only device authorized to authenticate the final contracts. It wasn't stored on any company server. It stayed with the negotiator. And right now, that negotiator was walking out of the building because months earlier, when the contracts were first drafted, I had quietly added something most people never questioned, a small clause. Simple language, but powerful enough to change everything. So, what exactly was hidden inside the contracts those CEOs were about to sign 6 months earlier? The deal was still just a framework. 15 companies, 9 countries, dozens of lawyers, hundreds of pages of draft agreements moving back and forth across email threads and midnight conference calls. That's where the real work happens in international partnerships, long before anyone talks about signing ceremonies or press releases. I was sitting in my office one night reviewing the 4th revision of the memorandum structure when a familiar problem appeared: leadership instability. It happens more often than people think. A deal gets negotiated over months, sometimes years, and then right before signing, someone gets promoted, replaced, or pushed out of the room. Trust evaporates. The entire agreement starts to wobble, so I added something small. A paragraph buried deep inside the section labeled mutual obligations. The language was simple. If the principal negotiator responsible for structuring the agreement was removed or replaced before the final signing session, all memorandums of understanding would automatically become void. Not suspended, not renegotiated, void. The explanation was easy to sell. Continuity of trust. Every CEO involved had invested months into the negotiation. They deserved to know that the person guiding the process would still be present when the final documents were signed. One by one, their legal teams reviewed the clause. None of them objected. In fact, several supported it. For them, it was protection. For the agreement, it was stability. And technically, the clause never mentioned me. Not once. But every contract draft still contained the same header line: lead negotiator, Elena Vargas. That information wasn't in the clause itself. It lived in the document metadata and the signing authorization fields attached to every MOU, which meant the clause didn't target a person. It protected a role I had held since the first negotiation call. Victoria Hale approved the contract drafts 2 months later. But she didn't read the full agreement. Most executives don't. They skim the executive summary, ask for the numbers, and assume the legal teams handled the rest. So when she signed off on the documents, she never noticed the one paragraph that mattered most. And she definitely didn't imagine anyone would trigger it. But what happens when someone removes the lead negotiator at the exact moment the deal is supposed to be signed? By the morning of the final negotiation call, the signs were already there. Not obvious signs. Small ones. The kind you only notice after spending 20 years inside conference rooms where power moves are planned weeks in advance. I saw the first clue in a logistics email sent the night before. Subject line: closing session setup, Astor conference room. Most of it looked routine: screen layout, translation headsets, conference call routing for international participants. But one line didn't belong there. Photography, positioning, capture, leadership transition moment. I read it twice. Leadership transition. That wasn't language used for a contract signing. That was stage language. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. A message from Nicole, one of the assistants who had been coordinating schedules for the visiting executives. She brought your replacement. I looked up from my desk. Who? I typed back. Her reply came almost instantly. Young Strategy VP. The one from the investor presentations. I knew exactly who she meant. 32 years old. Excellent at pitch decks. Had never participated in a single international negotiation call. Not one. The picture started to come together. Victoria Hale wasn't just planning to replace the negotiator. She wanted the moment documented. A clean transition. Old leadership out. New leadership stepping forward. Right in the middle of the closing call. The photographers would capture the handshake. The new executive would take the chair. The press team would circulate the images later as proof of decisive leadership. I closed the email and walked toward the conference room. 15 CEOs were already joining the call from their offices around the world. For them, this was the final step in a deal that had taken 6 months to assemble, and they were expecting the same negotiator who had been guiding every discussion since the beginning. Inside my briefcase, the titanium case with the encrypted signing token rested in its side pocket, the device required to authenticate the final contracts. Most executives assumed it was just another security tool. They never asked who actually controlled it. Down the hallway, I saw Victoria entering the conference room with the young strategy VP walking beside her. So the stage really was prepared. But there was one detail in the setup that Victoria clearly hadn't considered. The international conference system automatically recorded and broadcast the entire session, which meant every word spoken in that room would be heard live across 9 countries. So did Victoria Hale realize that every sentence she was about to say was still being heard across the world. The final negotiation session began exactly on schedule. 15 screens lit up along the conference wall. Tokyo, Munich, Oslo, Singapore, London, São Paulo, Paris, Dubai. 9 time zones represented in a single room. I glanced once at the document stack in front of me, then looked back at the screens. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice calm, "after 6 months of negotiation, all major points have been resolved." Several CEOs nodded. One of the legal teams began organizing the signature packets. "We are ready to proceed with the MOUs." For a moment, the room felt exactly the way it always does when a major deal reaches the final step. Quiet. Focused. Then Victoria Hale stood up. Her chair scraped softly against the marble floor. She didn't look at the screens first. She looked at me. "You've done your part," she said. Her tone was light, almost casual. Then she added the sentence she had clearly been waiting to say. "You're no longer needed." The words hung in the room for a second. Across the wall of monitors, several CEOs shifted in their seats. One of them leaned forward toward his microphone. "Excuse me," he said. "Is the negotiator being replaced?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "Yes," she replied. "Our leadership team will handle the final steps from here." She gestured toward the young strategy vice president standing near the wall. The woman stepped forward but didn't sit down. I closed the folder in front of me. No argument, no raised voice. Just a quiet movement as I stood and picked up my briefcase. "Understood," I said. Victoria was already turning back toward the conference table. "Security will escort you out," she added. I walked toward the door. Behind me, the conference monitors were still glowing with the faces of 15 CEOs. None of them had disconnected. Not yet. And inside my briefcase, the small titanium case containing the encrypted signing token moved with me, the only device authorized to authenticate the final contracts, which meant that when the door closed behind me, something very important was no longer inside that room. So what happens when the one person required to finalize a $2.4 billion agreement is suddenly removed from the table? The door closed behind Elena. Inside the conference room, Victoria Hale straightened the stack of contracts in front of her. "Let's continue," she said confidently. "We'll proceed with the signing." Across the monitors, 15 CEOs were still connected to the call. For a moment, no one spoke. No one. Victoria opened the first folder and began summarizing the agreement again. "As you know, this partnership covers technology licensing, regional distribution rights," and a voice interrupted from one of the screens. It was Bjorn Larson, the CEO from Oslo. "Before we continue," he said calmly, "could you clarify Clause 17? Victoria paused. She flipped a few pages. "Clause 17, she repeated. "Yes," Larson replied, "the negotiator continuity clause." For a second, the room went completely still. Victoria scanned the document quickly, her eyes moving faster with every page. "Well," she said finally, forcing a smile, "that clause simply outlines internal coordination between departments." One of the legal advisors on another screen leaned toward his microphone. Respectfully, he said, "That is not how the clause reads." Several of the executives began flipping through their own copies of the agreement. A quiet rustling of paper filled the room. Victoria tried to regain control. "As I said," she continued, "our leadership team will finalize the signing from here." Another voice spoke up. "Then who is the principal negotiator now?" Victoria gestured vaguely toward the strategy vice president standing near the wall. "Our team will handle it," she repeated. On the conference screen, one of the CEOs muted his microphone. A second later, his window disappeared. Participant disconnected. A few seconds passed, then another legal advisor leaned into frame on a different screen, whispering to someone off camera while pointing at the contract. 2 separate legal teams were now reviewing the document line by line. The conference interface flickered again. Participant disconnected. Victoria looked up at the screens, her confidence beginning to crack. "Is there a problem?" she asked. No one answered immediately. But on the monitors, the number of active participants had just dropped again. So why were the lawyers suddenly studying the contract instead of signing it? The silence on the conference line didn't last long. Bjorn Larson from Oslo leaned closer to his microphone. "Let's be precise," he said calmly. "Clause 17, the negotiator continuity clause." Victoria forced another smile. I'm sure our legal department can address that later, she replied. Right now, we should move forward with the signing. But Larson didn't move. Neither did the other executives. Across several screens, legal advisors were already flipping through their contract copies. One of them spoke next. A lawyer from Munich. Allow me to read the relevant section, he said. Paper shifted. Then his voice came through clearly. If the principal negotiator responsible for structuring the agreement is removed or replaced prior to final signing, all memorandums of understanding become automatically void. The words hung in the air. Victoria blinked. That clause refers to internal procedure, she said quickly. It does not affect the validity of the agreement. Another executive spoke, this time from Singapore. With respect, he said, the clause is quite explicit. Clause. Across the monitors, several legal advisors were already nodding. One of them leaned toward the microphone. Our interpretation is the same. The advisor said, the continuity requirement is active. Victoria flipped through the contract again. Faster now. That interpretation is incorrect, she insisted. The agreement remains in force. Then another voice joined the call. Who holds the signing authority? It came from the legal team in Toronto. A pause followed. Then the Munich lawyer answered the question. The principal negotiator. He didn't say the name. He didn't need to. At that exact moment, two screens went dark. Participant disconnected. The conference interface flickered. The number of participants dropped again. Across the room, the young strategy vice president looked suddenly unsure of where to stand. A notification appeared on the conference console. One of the investor observers had just sent a message to Meridian's board. Victoria stared at the screens, realization slowly settling in. The clause she had dismissed a minute earlier wasn't symbolic. It was operational. And the person who held the signing authority had just walked out of the building. So was a $2.4 billion deal about to collapse. Because of a clause no one thought mattered. The conference room had grown noticeably quieter. Victoria stood at the head of the table, still flipping through the contract pages as if the answer might suddenly appear between the lines. Across the monitors, the remaining CEOs watched without speaking. Then Bjorn Larson from Oslo leaned forward again. His voice was calm, deliberate. I believe we should address the clause directly, he said. Victoria looked up. There is no issue with the agreement, she replied quickly. Larson ignored the interruption. Clause 17, he continued. The principal negotiator. Continuity clause, one of the legal advisors on another screen nodded. Our interpretation confirms the clause is active. Another lawyer spoke next. The principal negotiator must be present for final signing. Without that condition, the memorandums cannot proceed. Victoria's voice tightened. The company remains fully authorized to complete the agreement. But Larson was already shaking his head. That is not how the document reads. He glanced briefly at his legal team. Then he spoke the sentence that ended the negotiation. Without Elena Vargas, the MOUs are void. No one argued. No one asked for clarification. The reaction was immediate. The screen showing the Munich office went dark. Participant disconnected. A second later, the Singapore window disappeared, then Sao Paulo, then Paris. The conference interface began updating rapidly as executives closed their connections one by one. Within less than a minute, the wall of screens that had filled the room with international faces was nearly empty. Victoria stared at the console. Another notification appeared. External participants, 0 downstairs. Meridian's legal department received an automated alert from the contract management system. Final signature missing. Agreement status. Invalid. At the same time, a message was already moving through the internal board network. $2.4 billion in partnership agreements had just evaporated. And all it had taken was one sentence. So, how fast can a $2.4 billion deal disappear? The conference room emptied quickly after the last screen went dark. For a moment, Victoria Hale just stood there, staring at the console where 15 international connections had existed only minutes earlier. Then the room exploded into motion. Get legal on the line, she snapped. Assistants rushed for their phones. Someone opened a laptop. The young strategy vice president stepped aside, looking as if she had accidentally wandered onto the wrong stage. Within minutes, Meridian's internal crisis channel was active. Public relations joined first. We need a statement, the PR director said. Something about unexpected negotiation complications. Victoria shook her head. No, she said sharply. We frame it as internal sabotage. The legal department connected next. Explain, the chief counsel asked. Victoria didn't hesitate. The negotiator abandoned the process, she said. She walked out during final signing. There was a pause on the line. One of the lawyers spoke carefully. Before we accuse anyone of sabotage, he said, we need to confirm the contractual structure. Another executive cut in. Send her a warning letter, someone suggested. Immediate legal notice. The idea spread quickly across the room. A formal accusation? A demand for explanation? Maybe even a lawsuit. But while the company was still deciding how to assign blame, something else had already started happening outside the building. Across 3 different cities, 3 CEOs who had just disconnected from the conference call were dialing a different number, Elena's phone. The first message arrived less than 10 minutes after the deal collapsed. We would prefer to continue negotiations with you directly. Another followed shortly after. If you were leading the deal independently, our position would change. Then a third, an investor who had been observing the call, sent a short email. Your documentation during the negotiation was impressive if you pursue the project independently. We would like to discuss funding. Inside Meridian's headquarters, Victoria was still preparing a legal threat. What she didn't realize was that the person she planned to accuse already had every email, draft contract, and negotiation record saved, complete documentation, a full paper trail, and 3 international CEOs who were suddenly more interested in the negotiator than the company she had just left. So what happens when the executives who walked away from a $2.4 billion deal decide they'd rather follow the person who built it? 3 months later, the conference room looked very different. Not the marble hall at Meridian. This room sat on the 45th floor of a quiet office tower overlooking the harbor. A smaller table, fewer assistants, no photographers waiting outside the door, but the people sitting around it were familiar. Hiroshi Tanaka from Tokyo, Arjun Mehta from Singapore, and Klaus Richter from Munich. 3 of the 15 CEOs who had disconnected from the call that morning. They weren't guests this time. They were partners. After leaving Meridian, I had opened a small firm specializing in international negotiations. No corporate hierarchy, no investor presentations about leadership optics, just the work itself, and the relationships that had taken 2 decades to build. The project on the table now looked strikingly similar to the one that collapsed 3 months earlier. Same markets, same infrastructure partnership, but the numbers were different. This agreement was worth $2.8 billion, $400 million more than the deal that had disappeared inside Meridian's conference room. Klaus slid a folder across the table toward me. Everything is finalized, he said. We're ready. Then he placed something small beside the document. A sleek black signing pen? I recognized it immediately. The one you left behind, Klaus said. The pen he had set on the conference table the day the deal collapsed. A quiet signal that the negotiation was finished. Thought it belonged to you now. I picked it up. The room grew silent as the final contract opened in front of me. No cameras, no speeches, just a table rebuilt on the same thing that had created the deal in the first place. Trust. I signed the agreement. Later that afternoon, another piece of news reached the industry press. Meridian's board had forced Victoria Hale to resign. Leadership failure. Loss of investor confidence. The headlines focused on the collapse of the $2.4 billion deal, but the real story was sitting in the room where the new agreement had just been signed. Because if every deal ultimately depends on trust, who really owns the table, the company? Or the person who built it? The folding chair sat in the corner of the room. Cold, metal, cheap. Completely out of place in a boardroom where people were about to finalize a contract worth $850 million. Your seat is in the back, Victoria Walsh said, pointing toward it. Her tone sounded polite, almost pleasant. But everyone in the room understood exactly what it meant. I don't believe you're qualified to sit at this table. A few people laughed. Not loudly, but enough for the entire room to hear. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent more than 20 years working in defense procurement finance and industry where a single signature can determine whether a company thrives or disappears. The conference room in Pentagon City looked exactly the way power is supposed to look: a long mahogany table, a wall-sized projection screen, and a security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. A small red light blinked steadily on the camera. Every meeting involving federal defense funding had to be recorded. I stepped further into the room and placed my black leather briefcase beside the table. Inside were the authorization documents for the private funding Walsh Defense needed to begin their new Pentagon communications program. $850 million. Without that money, their project would collapse before it even started. Victoria Walsh glanced down at her tablet as if I were a minor inconvenience. Consultants sit in the back, she added. We're discussing matters at a higher level. CEO, Brandon Walsh, said nothing. A few board members smiled like they were watching a mild piece of entertainment before the real meeting began. Only Scott, the company's chief financial officer, kept staring at my briefcase a moment longer than everyone else that I didn't sit in the folding chair. Instead, I remained standing and spoke calmly. If that's where you want me sitting, I said, then in 48 hours, $850 million will disappear from this contract. The laughter came again. No one in that room believed me, but the camera in the corner of the ceiling kept recording everything. And as usual, this story is a work of fiction, created by our editorial team for storytelling purposes. All characters, events, and organizations are fictional. Any resemblance is purely coincidental. Thank you, and let's continue. I looked around the table once more and wondered something very simple. Did anyone in that room realize they had just insulted the person controlling their money? For a moment after I spoke, the room stayed quiet. Then Aaron laughed. It wasn't loud, just confident. The kind of laugh people use when they're certain someone has just tried and failed to bluff their way into importance. A few others followed. Victoria Walsh didn't even look up from her tablet. Consultants do love dramatic statements, she said lightly. Let's stay focused. Brandon Walsh tapped the remote, and the projection screen lit up again. Deployment schedules, production timelines, charts showing how their new battlefield communication system would roll out across multiple military bases within the next 18 months. Every slide assumed the same thing, that the funding already existed. I stayed where I was, standing beside the table, my briefcase still resting on the floor. 6 months earlier, Walsh Defense Technologies had won one of the Pentagon's most competitive procurement bids. What they hadn't secured yet was the money required to actually build it. $850 million. Winning the contract had been the easy part. Building it required something else. $850 million in development capital before the Pentagon would release the first phase of government funding. That was where my firm came in. For more than 2 decades, we had specialized in financing defense contractors during that fragile moment between winning a federal award and actually delivering the technology. Most companies celebrated when they won the bid. Smart companies made sure they could afford to build it. Scott, the company's chief financial officer, shifted in his chair and cleared his throat. We still need confirmation of final authorization, he said carefully. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Legal will handle the paperwork. Scott didn't look convinced. His eyes moved briefly from the presentation screen to the black leather briefcase beside me. Authorization, he said slowly. Requires contract authority approval. Brandon Walsh frowned. That's already been arranged. Scott hesitated. Has it around the table? Several board members began flipping through their copies of the contract. Pages turned. Quiet murmurs spread through the room. For the first time since I had walked in, people were actually reading the document they had signed. And somewhere in those pages was a clause most of them clearly hadn't noticed. I watched their expressions change confusion first, then curiosity, because if they kept reading, they were about to discover something important. Had anyone in that room actually read the section that could shut their entire contract down? Paper has a sound when people suddenly realize it matters. Soft at first, then faster. Pages turned around the table as board members flipped through the contract binder, searching for the section Scott had just mentioned. Scott adjusted his glasses and leaned over his copy. Section 15, he said quietly. Several heads lifted. Victoria Walsh sighed as if the entire exercise were beneath her. Is this really necessary, she asked. We've had legal review this contract for months. Scott didn't respond immediately. He ran a finger down the page instead. Then he spoke again. This clause wasn't written by our legal team. That got attention. Brandon Walsh leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Scott turned the binder toward him. It's a professional conduct provision. Victoria laughed softly. So someone added a manners clause to a defense contract? Not exactly, Scott replied. He read slowly now, the way people do when they realize the words actually matter. Any documented behavior during negotiations that materially damages the professional working relationship between contractor and oversight authority may trigger immediate suspension of funding without prior notice. The room went quiet again. Aaron frowned. That sounds like standard legal protection. It isn't, Scott said. He tapped the margin of the page. This clause was customized. A few people began reading more carefully now. Another board member glanced toward the ceiling camera. The small red recording light blinked steadily. Victoria followed his gaze, then shrugged. Everything is recorded in these meetings. Security protocol. Yes, Scott said slowly. Exactly. Brandon Walsh leaned back in his chair. Even if the clause exists, he said, it's theoretical. No one's going to shut down a contract over something minor. I had been quiet until that moment. Now I spoke. It's not theoretical. Several people turned toward me again. Scott looked up from the document. You're familiar with the clause I am. Victoria rolled her eyes. Of course the consultant is familiar with the paperwork. I met her gaze calmly. I should be, I said. I'm the one who insisted it be included. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. Longer, heavier, because now they were beginning to understand something they hadn't understood before. If I had written the clause, then I probably knew exactly how it worked, and exactly when it could be used. The red light on the ceiling camera blinked again. Still recording, still documenting every word spoken in that room, which raised a question none of them had asked yet. If the clause depended on documented conduct, what exactly had the camera just captured? For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence in the room had changed again. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It was careful. Scott kept his finger on the page of the contract. If this clause is enforceable, he said slowly, then the question becomes, who determines whether a violation occurred? Brandon Walsh leaned forward. That would be legal. Scott shook his head slightly. Not exactly. He flipped another page in the binder and read the line again. This time, more quietly. Contract authority confirmation required for final funding authorization. Victoria waved a hand as if brushing away an annoying detail. That's procedural language. Scott didn't look convinced. It identifies the authority responsible for releasing the funds. Brandon frowned. Well, who is it? Several board members began scanning their copies again, flipping pages faster now. The answer wasn't hidden. It was printed clearly near the authorization section. Scott found it first. His eyes moved across the page, then stopped. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he looked up. At me. Brandon noticed the look. What he asked. Scott slowly turned the binder so the CEO could see the page. This section lists the contract authority. Brandon read the line silently. Then he looked up again. This says Evelyn Carter. No one laughed this time. Victoria stared at the page as if it must be a mistake. That can't be right, she said. Scott pushed the binder slightly closer. It's the signed authorization copy. The room was completely quiet now. I bent down, picked up my briefcase, and opened it on the table. Inside were the original authorization documents. Thick folders with Pentagon procurement seals stamped across the front. I slid one of them toward the center of the table. The first page showed the same line Scott had just read. Contract authority, Evelyn Carter. Private defense funding doesn't move automatically, I said calmly. Someone has to authorize it. Brandon Walsh stared at the document. And that someone is you. Yes. Another long pause. Victoria's voice was sharper now. You're telling us you control the $850 million I'm telling you, I replied, that the funding exists only if I approve the release. Around the table, people began exchanging uneasy looks, because suddenly the folding chair in the corner didn't look like a small insult anymore. It looked like a very expensive mistake, and the real problem hadn't even begun yet. What happens when the person holding the signature decides not to sign? No one spoke for several seconds after the documents hit the table. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The earlier laughter had disappeared, replaced by the quiet tension that fills a room when people realize a mistake may already be too late to fix. Victoria Walsh broke the silence first. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Well, she said, that certainly explains why the consultant feels so important. A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Brandon Walsh didn't smile. His eyes were still fixed on the authorization document. Victoria continued, but authority or not, that doesn't change protocol. She gestured again toward the corner of the room. The consultant seating area is still back there, the folding chair. Scott shifted uncomfortably. Victoria, she ignored him. This is a board-level coordination meeting, she said. If Ms. Carter wants to attend, she can sit where consultants sit. The red light on the security camera blinked quietly above us, recording everything. I looked at the chair in the corner. Then back at Victoria. You're certain, I asked calmly. Her smile returned. Yes, Brandon finally spoke. Victoria, maybe we should... She cut him off. No, if we start rearranging the room every time someone wants special treatment, we'll never finish this meeting. Aaron chuckled again. though it sounded less confident this time. I closed the folder on the table and slid it back into my briefcase. Then I picked up my phone. Scott noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Documenting the situation," I replied. Victoria rolled her eyes. "This is getting ridiculous." I stepped away from the table and walked toward the door. At the threshold, I stopped. "One last thing," I said. Several heads turned toward me. "The conduct provision in your contract doesn't require intent," I continued. "Only documented behavior that damages a professional working relationship." Scott's face had gone pale. Victoria laughed again. "You're threatening us over a chair, no?" I said. "I'm explaining what happens when a company forgets who controls the money." I stepped into the hallway and dialed a number on my secure phone. The call connected on the second ring. "Go ahead," my partner's voice said. "Initiate suspension protocol." I said, "Defense Contract 7749 Alpha." A short pause. "Reason code? Professional conduct violation. Effective when in 48 hours. The line went silent for a moment. Then my partner answered. "Understood." I ended the call. Inside the conference room, they were probably returning to their slides and projections, still assuming the money existed. But the process had already started. And federal procedures move faster than most companies expect, which meant one very simple question remained. When the Pentagon received the notice tomorrow morning, how long would it take the board to realize what they had just triggered? The email arrived at 8:03 a.m. It didn't look dramatic. No bold warnings, no threatening language, just a standard notification from Pentagon procurement systems. The kind that appears quietly in a company inbox and then changes everything. Administrative review notice, I read the message once, then set my coffee down beside my tablet. Across town, inside Walsh Defense Technologies, the morning probably started like any other, until someone opened the same email. Scott opened it first. The subject line alone made his stomach tighten. He read the first paragraph, then the second. By the time he reached the words "conduct related administrative review," he was already standing. "Brandon," he said sharply. The CEO looked up from the financial dashboard on the wall screen. "What is it?" Scott turned the laptop toward him. Brandon read silently. Then again. "What the hell is this?" he said. Around the conference table, several board members leaned closer. Scott answered before anyone else could. "It's a Pentagon review notice." Victoria Walsh frowned. A review of what Scott pointed to the line halfway down the message. "Professional conduct during pre-contract negotiations." The room went quiet. Brandon's voice dropped. "That's not possible." "It is," Scott replied. He scrolled further down the notice. "Pending review completion." He read slowly. "All associated funding authorizations are temporarily suspended." Victoria sat up straighter. What does that mean? Scott didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what temporarily suspended funding meant for a project that required $850 million before the first phase could even begin. Brandon grabbed his phone. "Call legal," he said. Scott shook his head. Legal already saw it. How Scott pointed to the timestamp at the bottom of the message. The notice had been copied to corporate legal, Pentagon oversight, federal procurement compliance, and the private funding authority, which meant the review wasn't just a warning, it was already in motion. Brandon stared at the screen for another long moment. Then he asked the question every executive asks when a problem suddenly becomes real. Who triggered this? Scott didn't answer right away, because everyone in the room already knew. The only person in the contract who had the authority to do it. Which raised a much more dangerous question. If the Pentagon had already frozen the funding, what else were they about to freeze next? By noon, the situation had escalated beyond internal damage control. Walsh Defense Technologies' emergency board meeting was already underway. Scott sat at the end of the table with 3 open laptops in front of him. Legal was on one call, investor relations on another. The third screen showed the Pentagon review notice that had triggered the entire crisis. Brandon Walsh stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear. "No, listen to me," he said sharply. "This is procedural. It doesn't mean the program is canceled." Across the table, one of the outside directors shook his head. "It means the funding is frozen." Victoria Walsh leaned forward. "For how long?" Scott answered without looking up. "Minimum 48 hours, possibly longer." "That's nothing," Victoria replied. "We can absorb 2 days." Scott finally looked at her. "This isn't just the funding." He turned the laptop so the rest of the board could see. Another message had arrived 20 minutes earlier. "Pentagon Procurement Review Team assigned." Brandon ended his call. What does that mean? He asked. Scott spoke carefully. It means the review moved from administrative to investigative. Silence settled over the room. A lawyer on the conference call spoke through the speakerphone. We've reviewed the contract language, she said. The conduct clause is enforceable. Victoria frowned. Over a seating disagreement. That's not how the clause works, the lawyer replied. It evaluates professional conduct during negotiations. If the oversight authority determines the relationship has been compromised, funding can be suspended immediately. One of the directors rubbed his forehead. Do they have proof? Scott looked toward the ceiling instinctively, even though the meeting room camera wasn't recording this one. Yes, he said quietly. The Pentagon requested the footage from yesterday's meeting. Brandon's expression hardened. They're seriously investigating this. Scott nodded. And that's not the only problem. He tapped another email on the screen. This one came from their largest private investor. We need clarification regarding the Pentagon review before proceeding with the capital commitment. Victoria read the line twice. They're hesitating over a temporary review. Scott's voice dropped. No, they're hesitating because if the Pentagon flags our company for conduct violations, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. In defense contracting, reputation moved faster than money. And once the government started questioning a contractor's culture, every future contract became a risk. Brandon stared at the screen, then slowly exhaled. So this review, he said quietly, if it goes the wrong way, Scott nodded once, then the $850 million isn't the real problem anymore, because another question was now hanging over the entire company. If the Pentagon decided Walsh Defense couldn't be trusted, how many other contracts would disappear with it Wednesday evening? The call finally came. I was still at my office when my secure phone lit up with a Washington number I recognized. Evelyn Carter speaking. Ms. Carter. This is Colonel Patricia Hayes from Pentagon Procurement Review. Her voice was calm, professional, and completely neutral, the tone people use when the outcome has already been decided. I'm calling regarding the administrative review involving Walsh Defense Technologies. I expected your call, I said. There was a brief pause on the line. We've completed the preliminary assessment, she continued. Security camera footage, witness statements, and contract documentation have all been reviewed. Across town, the same news was arriving at Walsh Defense. Scott sat in the boardroom again, though the mood there was nothing like it had been 2 days earlier. No presentations, no slides, just phones, laptops, and a group of executives waiting for the result of something they could no longer control. What are they saying? Brandon Walsh asked. Scott held the phone to his ear while the Pentagon representative spoke. Then he closed his eyes briefly. They confirmed the conduct violation, he said quietly. Victoria leaned forward immediately. That's absurd. Scott shook his head. They cited the recorded meeting. The footage shows the exchange clearly. The lawyer on the speakerphone spoke next. The clause allows immediate suspension if professional conduct compromises the working relationship with the oversight authority. Brandon's voice hardened. So what does that mean for the funding? Scott swallowed. It means the $850 million capital authorization has been withdrawn. The words seemed to drain the room of air. Back in my office, Colonel Hayes continued explaining the rest of the report. The contractor will be suspended from active federal bids pending a full compliance review, she said. Additional oversight measures will apply if they attempt to re-enter the procurement process. How long is the suspension period, I asked. Preliminary recommendation is 18 months. Across the city, Brandon Walsh was asking the exact same question. 18 months, he repeated. Scott nodded slowly. In defense contracting, the lawyer said quietly over the speakerphone. That's close to a death sentence. Brandon leaned back in his chair. 2 days earlier, they had laughed over a folding chair. Now the Pentagon had finished writing the report that could erase their company from the industry. And one question remained. When a government agency decides your company can't be trusted, who in the market is willing to trust you next? By Thursday morning, Walsh Defense had only one strategy left. Fight the narrative. The emergency PR team arrived before sunrise. Lawyers filled the conference room. Crisis consultants dialed into video calls from New York and Washington. On the wall screen, the headline had already appeared. Defense contractor under Pentagon conduct review. Brandon Walsh stared at it for a long moment. This isn't over, he said. Across the table, Scott looked tired. What exactly do you plan to fight? Brandon turned toward the legal team. We challenge the review. File a counterclaim if necessary. This whole thing started because of a misunderstanding. Victoria nodded quickly. Yes, we were never informed of her authority. Scott spoke quietly. That's not what the documents say. Brandon ignored him. Draft a statement, he said to the PR director. We'll clarify the situation publicly. The PR director hesitated. Clarify what exactly? That the review was triggered by a consultant who misrepresented her role. The room fell silent. Scott looked up slowly. That's not going to hold. Why not? Victoria snapped. Scott turned his laptop so the rest of the room could see the screen. A message from Pentagon Procurement had arrived 15 minutes earlier. Official evidence request confirmation. Attached below it was a single line, security recording from negotiation meeting received and archived. The lawyer on the speakerphone spoke again. If the footage shows what the report says, it shows. Any public statement contradicting it could be considered misleading. Brandon's jaw tightened. So what are you suggesting? The lawyer didn't hesitate. Do nothing publicly. Victoria scoffed. Doing nothing makes us look guilty? Scott closed the laptop slowly. At this point, he said, the footage already decided that. The room went quiet again. Outside the building, industry news had already begun spreading. Defense contractors talked to each other. Investors talked to analysts. Analysts talked to reporters. And every one of those conversations was asking the same question. If Walsh Defense had treated a government oversight authority that way during a negotiation, what would happen when the Pentagon looked deeper into the company's culture? Brandon Walsh finally spoke again. We're not letting one recording destroy this company. Scott met his gaze. It's not the recording, he said quietly. It's what the recording proves. Because once the Pentagon had evidence of a conduct violation, the company's problem wasn't public relations anymore. It was credibility. And credibility, once lost in government contracting, rarely came back, which left one final question hanging over the boardroom. When the entire industry had seen the footage, who would still be willing to do business with them? The official notice arrived Thursday afternoon. Pentagon Procurement had finalized the review. Walsh Defense Technologies was suspended from all federal contracting for 18 months. No appeals, no expedited reconsideration. Just a quiet, clinical paragraph explaining that the contractor had failed to meet professional conduct expectations during negotiations with an authorized oversight authority. The market reacted faster than the lawyers. Within hours, Walsh Defense stock dropped nearly 40% in after-hours trading. Their largest investor withdrew the pending capital commitment. Two smaller defense subcontractors publicly terminated partnership discussions. Inside the company, the board acted just as quickly. Brandon Walsh was removed as CEO before the week ended. Victoria Walsh resigned the following morning. But by then, it was already too late. A defense contractor that couldn't bid on government work had very little left to sell. 6 months later, Walsh Defense filed for bankruptcy protection. 200 employees lost their jobs not because the technology failed, not because the market collapsed, but because leadership had turned a moment of basic professionalism into a public demonstration of arrogance. Across the industry, the case became something else entirely. A precedent. Pentagon Procurement quietly launched a new initiative focused on contractor conduct compliance. The program required independent oversight during sensitive negotiations and documented professional standards training for executive leadership teams. A few weeks later, I walked into a conference room in the same Pentagon City building where the original meeting had taken place. 12 executives from different defense companies were already seated around the table. When I entered, every one of them stood. No one pointed to a folding chair. I placed my briefcase on the table and took my seat. The room waited for the meeting to begin. Because in defense contracting, people eventually learn the lesson the hard way. You can insult a person in a boardroom, but you cannot insult the authority written into a contract. Thank you for listening. If this story made you stop and think, hit like to support, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment with your perspective. We read everyone. Anyone over 40 should start thinking about their next chapter, our new CEO said with a smile. At first, people laughed. They thought it was a joke. Then HR started handing out resignation envelopes. By the end of the week, most of the engineers who built the company were gone, including me. What our CEO didn't know was that the system his entire company depended on, the one he just promised investors was fully owned technology, was never actually theirs. And 3 days later, that mistake was about to cost him everything. The moment our new CEO stepped onto the stage, the room went quiet. Adrian Wolf was 33, sharp suit, confident smile, the kind of executive who spoke like every meeting was a product launch. Behind him, the screen lit up. Strategic workforce modernization. He waited until the room settled. Then he said something that made half the audience stop breathing. Let's be honest, Adrian said, pacing slowly. Companies move faster when they're younger. A few people laughed. Startup humor? Then he added, anyone over 40 should start thinking about their next chapter. The laughter died almost instantly. I sat 3 rows from the front, notebook open, pen still in my hand. Around me, people stopped laughing. Some stared at the stage. Others looked down at their laptops, as if the sentence might somehow disappear from the air. It didn't, because a moment later, HR walked down the aisles. White envelopes, one by one, they placed them into people's hands. Voluntary separation agreements, severance packages, non-disclosure clauses. When the envelope reached me, then I turned it over slowly. My name was printed across the front. 14 years in that building, reduced to a white envelope. I didn't argue. I didn't even open it. Instead, I looked at the HR director and asked one question. Could you confirm the exact time my advisory role officially ends? She hesitated for half a second. Friday, 5 p.m. I nodded, because what no one in that room realized yet was that the system this company depended on was never actually theirs. The office changed faster than anyone expected. Not overnight, but close. The week after the meeting, HR started scheduling what they called private conversations. 10 minutes on the calendar, sometimes 15. No one came back from those meetings looking the same. By the second week, the pattern was obvious. You walked into the room, HR was already seated. A folder waited on the table. Inside the folder were 2 options: voluntary resignation, or a polite sentence that meant the same thing. Your role may be eliminated during restructuring. Some people argued, most didn't. 6 months of severance was hard to ignore, so was the NDA. By the 3rd week, the office felt half empty. Slack channels that used to move all day now stayed quiet for hours. The DevOps lead disappeared first. I had worked beside him for 12 years. Watching his desk empty overnight felt less like restructuring and more like erasing part of the company's memory. Then Marisol from legal, then Daniel, the QA architect who knew the testing system better than anyone alive. One by one, the people who understood the company's foundations were gone. Officially, the company called it modernization. Unofficially, everyone knew why it was happening. Stratonix was preparing for Series D funding. A new government partnership demo was scheduled in 6 weeks. Investors liked lean teams. They liked young executives talking about speed and disruption. Adrian wanted the company to look faster, cheaper, younger. But after a few weeks, I noticed something else. Almost everyone leaving shared 2 things. They were over 40, and they worked in infrastructure. The people who actually knew how the system worked. Late Thursday afternoon, HR sent the final confirmation email. Advisory role termination effective Friday, 5 p.m. I replied with one line. Thank you for confirming. That night, after the office lights shut off and the city outside my window went quiet, I opened a contract I hadn't looked at in years. A contract almost everyone in that building had forgotten existed. But I hadn't. The office changed faster than anyone expected. Not overnight, but close. The week after the meeting, HR started scheduling what they called private conversations. 10 minutes on the calendar, sometimes 15. No one came back from those meetings looking the same. People walked in with laptops and coffee mugs. They walked out holding folders. By the 2nd week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. You walked into the room. HR was already seated. A folder waited on the table. Inside were 2 options: voluntary resignation, or a polite sentence that meant the same thing. Your role may be eliminated during restructuring. Some people argued, most didn't. 6 months of severance was difficult to refuse. So was the NDA. By the 3rd week, the office felt different, not emptier, quieter. Slack channels that once moved all day now sat silent for hours. The DevOps lead disappeared first. I had worked beside him for 12 years. Seeing his desk cleared overnight felt less like restructuring and more like erasing part of the company's memory. Then Marisol from legal, then Daniel, the QA architect who knew the testing system better than anyone alive. One by one, the people who understood how the company actually worked were gone. Officially, the company called it modernization. Unofficially, everyone knew what it was. Stratonics was preparing for its Series D funding round. A government partnership demonstration was scheduled in 6 weeks. Investors liked lean teams. They liked executives talking about speed, about disruption. Adrian wanted the company to look faster, cheaper, younger. But after a few weeks, I noticed something else. Almost everyone leaving shared two things. They were over 40. And they worked in infrastructure. The people who actually understood the system. Late Thursday afternoon. HR sent the final confirmation email. Advisory role termination effective. Friday, 5 p.m., I replied with one line. Thank you for confirming. That night, after the office lights went dark and the city outside my window grew quiet, I opened a contract I hadn't looked at in years, a contract almost everyone in that building had forgotten existed. But I hadn't. The compliance notice went out the next morning, not to the entire company, not even to the executive team. Just 3 recipients, the board chair, the general counsel, and the company's external counsel. My name appeared as the licensing party requesting review. Adrian Wolf wasn't copied, which meant the most important person in the building had no idea a clock had just started running. 72 hours. While that clock ticked down quietly in the background, the company kept moving forward at full speed. Adrian had bigger things on his mind. The board had been pushing for aggressive growth since the last funding round. Investors wanted momentum, and Adrian had promised them a faster, leaner company. Stratonics was preparing for a Series D funding round, and in 6 weeks, the company would present its platform to a group of government partners exploring those automation contracts. But Adrian didn't want to wait 6 weeks. He wanted momentum. The investor team announced a live product demonstration scheduled for the following Monday, a live stream for analysts, early investors, and several government observers. To make the demo look impressive, engineering received a last-minute directive. Move the new production deployment forward, 2 days earlier than planned. Aurora always ran a full compliance verification during production deployment. It was part of the architecture I had written years earlier. Every new release forced the system to verify licensing signatures before going live. The message hit Slack late that afternoon. Deployment rescheduled, Monday morning. I read it twice. Then I opened the compliance timeline my attorney had forwarded. The numbers were simple. The new deployment window would land almost exactly at hour 71 of the review period. 1 hour before the 72-hour window closed. I didn't touch the system. I didn't change a line of code. Instead, I did the same thing I had done for 14 years. I watched. System logs scrolled quietly across my screen. Internal dashboards updated. Engineering channels debated deployment timing as if nothing unusual was happening. Late that night, my attorney sent one more message. If the ownership language is inaccurate, he wrote, the board may face disclosure liability. I read the sentence twice, then I closed my laptop. Because by Monday morning, the entire company would be watching Aurora run live. And if the engine decided to verify compliance during that demonstration, no one in that room would be able to ignore the result. The live stream began at exactly 9 o'clock. By then, the company had turned the main conference hall into a studio. 2 cameras faced the stage. The investor relations team monitored the broadcast from a side table. Adrian Wolf stepped into the lights like he had done it 100 times before. Good morning, everyone, he said smoothly. Today, we're excited to show you the technology powering Stratonics' next phase of growth. Behind him, the giant screen displayed the Aurora dashboard. From my desk across town, I opened the same monitoring window and watched the system logs scroll in real time. Adrian continued speaking. Our platform processes millions of transactions every day through our proprietary core architecture. Then he turned slightly toward the screen. Let's see it in action. The dashboard loaded. Clean interface, real-time routing metrics, transaction flow moving smoothly across the map. For a few seconds, everything worked perfectly. 4 seconds, to be exact. Then the screen froze. At first, it looked like a minor delay. Adrian paused, still smiling, waiting for the interface to refresh. Instead, the dashboard dimmed. A gray banner appeared across the center of the screen. Compliance lock active. Core system signature missing. Engine restricted to integrity mode. The room went silent. On the live stream feed, investor comments began appearing almost immediately. Why does it say licensed? Is this a compliance issue? Adrian glanced at the screen, then back toward the camera. He gave a quick, practiced laugh. Our platform is fully owned technology, he said. What you're seeing is simply a temporary verification state. Across my screen, a new email notification appeared from General Counsel. The message was only one line: "We need to speak with Ms. Voss immediately." I leaned back in my chair. For a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far. Then I remembered the envelopes in the auditorium. Because the moment Adrian repeated that statement on a live investor call, the problem had just become much bigger than a software glitch. The email arrived less than 15 minutes after the live stream ended. By mid-afternoon, external counsel had already reviewed the investor recording and the Aurora licensing contract. What had looked like a technical glitch that morning was now being treated as a potential disclosure issue. Subject: immediate board meeting. The message came directly from the general counsel. Ms. Voss, the board requests your presence this evening. No explanation. Just a time and a location. 7 p.m., executive conference room. By the time I arrived that night, the building felt different, quieter, tighter. The same hallway I had walked through for 14 years now felt like a courtroom waiting area. Inside the conference room, the entire board was already seated. Adrian Wolf stood near the far end of the table, arms crossed, speaking with one of the directors. His tone was calm, almost impatient. It was a temporary system glitch, he said. Engineering will resolve it before morning. No one responded. Because at the head of the table sat someone Adrian clearly hadn't expected, the company's external counsel. The attorney waited until everyone was seated before speaking. What happened today, he began, is no longer a technical issue. He slid a printed document across the table. In the investor presentation, Aurora was described as fully owned proprietary technology. He paused, letting the sentence settle. If that statement is inaccurate, investors could claim material misrepresentation. A director leaned forward. What does that mean for us? The attorney didn't soften the answer. It means the board could face fiduciary liability for approving or allowing inaccurate disclosures. The room went very still. Millions in funding were tied to the upcoming Series D round. Government contracts were already under review, and suddenly the risk wasn't theoretical anymore. One of the board members turned toward me. Ms. Voss, he said carefully, did you deliberately shut down the system during the demo? I shook my head. The system didn't shut down. I said, it entered compliance mode exactly as the contract requires. Across the table, Adrian finally stopped talking. Because if the system had followed the contract perfectly, then the real question wasn't about software. It was about who had created the legal risk in the first place. The general counsel was the first to break the silence. Without saying a word, she opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the board. An email filled the display. 2 weeks ago, she said calmly, our office issued a legal advisory regarding the Aurora system. She scrolled down and highlighted a paragraph. The room leaned closer. Avoid describing Aurora as company-owned intellectual property. The technology is licensed from Voss Systems LLC. The message had been addressed directly to the CEO, Adrian Wolf. For several seconds, no one spoke. Adrian finally leaned forward in his chair. That memo was about wording, he said. Investor presentations simplify things. They're expecting scale, he added. If we start explaining licensing structures, the entire narrative collapses. The licensing detail wasn't important to the narrative. Across the table, a few directors exchanged looks. External counsel didn't. He folded his hands and spoke in a measured tone. It becomes important the moment you certify ownership during a fundraising call. The sentence hung in the air. Adrian shifted in his seat. I didn't certify anything, he said quickly. I was explaining the architecture. The board chair turned slightly. Did you repeat that ownership claim during today's live stream? No one answered right away. Then one of the directors reached for the remote control on the table. The conference screen flickered to life. The replay loaded quickly. Adrian appeared on stage again, standing beneath the Aurora dashboard. The video ran for a few seconds. Then the moment arrived. Our platform is fully owned technology, Adrian said confidently. The director paused the clip. No one moved. No one needed further explanation. Because that statement had not been made in a private meeting, it had been delivered during a live investor broadcast. External counsel closed the laptop slowly. If investors relied on that statement while evaluating funding, he said, the board could face direct exposure. Around the table, Several directors sat back in their chairs because the question in front of them was no longer about the software. It was about responsibility and whether the entire board had just been placed at legal risk by a single sentence. External counsel leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. What matters now, he said, is exposure. He glanced briefly at the paused video on the screen before continuing. If investors believe they were given inaccurate information about core technology ownership, they may claim material misrepresentation. Several directors shifted in their seats. The attorney continued calmly. That kind of claim can affect more than a funding round. He raised 3 fingers. First, the Series D financing could collapse if investors determined the company's disclosures were inaccurate. A second finger, second, any government partnership review may be paused until the ownership issue is clarified. Then the third, directors who approved or relied on those statements may face individual liability. The words landed heavily in the room. Not the company. The board members themselves. One of the directors exhaled slowly and leaned back in his chair. No one here signed up to defend a lawsuit over wording, he said. Another director spoke more bluntly. We need to isolate the decision. Across the table, Adrian Wolf straightened. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. Marketing language simplifies things all the time. Investors understand that. He gestured toward the frozen dashboard on the screen. This whole thing started because the system overreacted. No one responded immediately. Then several heads turned toward me. I kept my voice even. Aurora didn't fail. I said, "It verified ownership." Adrian scoffed quietly. External counsel didn't. He opened a folder beside him and reviewed the printed contract pages. The system behavior appears consistent with the licensing agreement, he said after a moment. He looked around the table. We have no evidence of sabotage. The sentence shifted the entire tone of the room, because if the system had acted exactly as designed, then the real problem had not come from the infrastructure. It had come from the statement made during the live stream. One of the directors tapped a pen slowly against the table. If the system is functioning correctly, he said, then the risk didn't start with engineering. He looked toward the far end of the table. It started with the person who made the claim, and the board now had to decide what to do about it. The board chair looked around the table once more. Then he closed the folder in front of him. We're going to take 10 minutes, he said. Directors only. The meeting paused. Adrian remained standing near the end of the table, clearly expecting the break to settle things. He spoke quietly with one of the directors while the others stepped out of the room. When they returned 10 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed. The conversations were gone. So was the uncertainty. The board chair sat down and folded his hands. We've reviewed the situation, he said. One of the directors leaned forward slightly. I'm putting forward a motion. He glanced briefly toward Adrian before continuing. To suspend CEO Adrian Wolf pending a formal governance review. For a moment, the words didn't seem to register. Then Adrian let out a short laugh. You're suspending me over wording, he said. Across the table. The general counsel responded immediately. We're protecting the board from liability. The room fell quiet again. The board chair looked down the table, all in favor. One by one, hands rose. First 2, then 4, then every remaining director. The motion passed unanimously. Adrian stared at the table as if the outcome might still reverse itself. But the board chair had already moved on. Effective immediately, he said. Mr. Wolf is relieved of operational authority pending investigation. The conditions were read quickly. Adrian would no longer oversee daily operations. He would not communicate with investors. And he would cooperate fully with the internal governance review. No one argued. No one needed to, because the decision had already been made. Then the board chair turned toward me. The tone in his voice shifted slightly. Ms. Voss, he said, we need someone who actually understands the system. Several directors nodded. We'd like to discuss your return to Stratonics. I didn't answer right away, because returning to the company wasn't the difficult decision. The real question was something else entirely. Under what terms? The board chair didn't waste time. We would like you to return to Stratonics, he said, looking directly at me, as interim chief technology officer. The room stayed quiet. No one needed to explain why. The company's most critical system had just exposed a governance crisis in front of investors. The board needed stability, and they needed it fast. I folded my hands on the table. I'm open to the discussion, I said. Several directors nodded with visible relief, but I wasn't finished. There are conditions. The relief disappeared just as quickly. First, I said, Aurora needs to be handled properly. Either the company purchases the engine outright or the licensing agreement is rewritten with full transparency. A few board members exchanged looks. Second, the workforce modernization program ends immediately. I paused. The people who built the infrastructure were pushed out. That decision needs to be reversed. One director frowned slightly. That's expensive. Third, I continued, the senior engineers who were forced to leave should be invited back. The director shook his head. That slows us down. I didn't raise my voice. Which brings me to the fourth condition. I looked around the room. Every future production deployment requires architecture sign-off. The silence that followed was longer than before. Finally, one of the directors leaned forward. You're asking the board to slow the company down. Before I could answer, external counsel spoke calmly from the end of the table. Speed created this problem. No one argued after that. The board chair looked down the table once more, all in favor. This time, the vote took less than 5 seconds. Every hand rose again. The conditions were accepted. Just like that. The control Adrian had tried to centralize was being rebuilt into something very different. The board chair turned back toward me. Welcome back, Miss Voss. I nodded slightly, because returning wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part would be deciding what to do with a company that had nearly destroyed itself. 3 months later, Stratonics looked like a different company. Not because the office had changed, because the people inside it had. Aurora was running smoothly again. The system logs moved quietly across the monitoring screens, steady and predictable, just like they always had. Several of the engineers who had left during the modernization program were back. DevOps, QA, infrastructure. The people who had built the foundations of the platform in the first place. The investor calls resumed as well. Series D negotiations restarted carefully. Lawyers were still rewriting disclosure language line by line. Some investors had walked away permanently, this time with far more attention to language in the disclosure documents. And Adrian Wolf was no longer the CEO. The official statement appeared one Monday morning. No one mentioned the live stream, but everyone in the industry had seen it. Adrian Wolf has stepped down following a governance review. The company will begin a leadership transition effective immediately. The press release was polite, corporate, inside the company. Everyone understood what it really meant. I didn't spend much time thinking about it. Instead, I walked down the quiet hallway toward the infrastructure wing. The server room sounded the same as it always had. A constant, low hum of machines doing their work. Aurora didn't care about board meetings or investor calls. It just ran. I stepped inside and looked at the racks for a moment before placing a small metal plaque on the wall beside the monitoring console. The engraving was simple. Experience is not overhead. It is infrastructure. Companies change strategies all the time. Leaders come and go. But if you remove the people who actually understand how things work, the system has a way of reminding you. Aurora didn't destroy Stratonics. It simply forced the company to tell the truth.